The Civil War was the most gruesome and deadliest conflicts in American history. Around 620,000 men died, which is more than World War I, World War II, the Korean War and the Vietnam War all combined. 476,000 soldiers were wounded by artillery shrapnel, bullets, bayonets and swords. The weapons used during the war had a significant impact when it struck its target. The bullet used was called the Minie Ball, a conical bullet with hollowed grooves that were fired from muzzle-loading rifles. It was one of the main reasons the war was so deadly. As the Minie Ball struck its victim, it damaged muscle, splintered bone, and brought a lot of debris in the wounds. The Minie Ball was built to greatly improve the use of muskets for soldiers, making it much more deadly, and most likely led to the need for amputation as it would flatten upon impact, causing severe damage. On its way down the barrel, the bullet would grip the spiral rifling and spin tightly along its course, which greatly increased its accuracy and range, where it allowed the musket to shoot at a range of 250 yards. The cannonball was also used at battles that often left its victims with a stump of an arm or a leg. Most wounds required amputation. This is a surgical procedure to remove a piece of the body due to severe trauma or infection. 3/4 of all Civil War surgeries were amputations. Surgeons would often gain the reputation as butchers. This was due to the amount of piles of discarded limbs that the medical personnel just simply didn't know what to do with them. Hello and welcome to History Vault. Today, we will be going over the Civil War between the Union and Confederate soldiers and why it was the most brutal and deadliest war for America in just the span of 4 years. The Civil War lasted between 1861 and 1865 and was fought between the Union and the Confederates. The Union was what is referred to as the North. They had anti-slavery beliefs, focused on manufacturing, and were a larger federal government in the northern states. Whereas the Confederates were in the southern states, they were pro-slavery. They believed in state rights and based their economy on agriculture, where cotton was the most important crop at that time. Cotton was as much as 59% of U.S. exports. In 1820, the Missouri Compromise allowed Missouri to become a slave state, which was what first sparked anti-slave sentiment in the North, and would continue on for the coming years. Historians believe that the religious ideas that was brought up during the Great Awakening is what inspired many to rise up against slavery. This encouraged new morals that focused on the idea that all men are created equal within the eyes of God. Laws were set in the coming years to further provoke the anti-slavery movements, like in the year 1850 and the Fugitive Slave Act, which required that any escaped slave were to be returned to their owners. With the Dred Scott decision in 1857, African American people, free or enslaved, didn't have legal rights. This encouraged abolitionists like Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, Susan B. Anthony, and along with others who would speak up in support of the abolitionist movement. When President Lincoln was in office in March 1861, the southern states were rebelling against the northern states in support of slavery. President Lincoln issued a proclamation calling for the sum of 75,000 troops in order to suppress the rebellion. In April 1861, as the conflicts and power struggle between the North reached its tipping point, the Confederates in Charleston, South Carolina, fired at a Union-held Fort Sumter, and at that point the Civil War has begun. There were many significant battles that left many wounded to flood the dressing stations. These were the first stop for wounded soldiers, which were small tents just far enough from the front lines to aid to the soldiers right away, and were crucial to have during the war. They were heavily used in major battles like Fort Donelson, Vicksburg, and one of the most significant battles of the war, the Battle of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, where there were many casualties on both sides. Union casualties got up to 23,000, whereas the Confederate lost 28,000 men, making it the deadliest battle in the Civil War in just a span of 3 days. Amputations was very common among surgical procedures at these battles, and the surgeons were often criticized of performing them on patients that didn't necessarily need them. The amount of times that surgeons resorted to amputations was seen as butchery by soldiers, but in the surgeon's eyes, it is seen as the quickest and most effective way of treating as many patients as they could in a short amount of time. During and after battles, surgeons wanted to clear up their beds quickly so they could pull in the next patient as quick as possible. General Carl Schurz described a nightmarish scene at Gettysburg, saying, "There stood the surgeons, their sleeves rolled up to their elbows, their knives not seldom between their teeth. The surgeon snatched his knife from between his teeth, wiped it rapidly once or twice across his blood-stained apron, and the cutting began. The operation accomplished, the surgeon would look around with a deep sigh, and then, 'Next!' The soldiers were given chloroform as anesthesia, and the surgeon would tie a tourniquet tightly around the limb to reduce blood loss during the amputation. Surgeons would work on 48 to 72-hour shifts, one patient after the other. Something unknown by surgeons was also the amount of time they had to amputate a limb. There were two types of different amputations considered by surgeons. They were primary and secondary amputations. Primary was performing the amputation within 24 to 48 hours after the injury, and secondary was anytime after 3 days. Primary saved lives, secondary did not. If they waited too long to amputate, they would risk a horribly infected wound. There were 4 different secondary types of infections recognized at the time: hospital gangrene, erysipelas, tetanus, and septicemia, all very deadly. If it wasn't the horrible agony of being shot by a Minie ball. Diseases also swept over the tents as the soldiers were very vulnerable to different sicknesses breaking out amongst them. They were tightly coupled up with each other during the war, so it was easy for sickness to spread. Diseases like typhoid, measles, smallpox, and worst of all, dysentery, which accounted for around 45,000 deaths in the Union Army and 50,000 deaths for the Confederates. The reason dysentery was so lethal was its ability to spread throughout both armies due to contaminated water and lack of sanitation. When the war was first started, soldiers would construct latrines close to streams that would contaminate the drinking water for others downstream. They would do this constantly without the knowledge of what they were doing and how they were affecting others. Another factor that contributed was the lack of knowledge of cross-contamination. For surgeons, there was not a thought of washing and sanitizing all of their surgical equipment. So it goes without saying that they did not wash their hands in between patients either. Their ignorance would be the biggest mistake that would contribute to the spread of these illnesses. These times were seen by some historians who described negatively about the Civil War medical practices, stating they were seen as the Middle Ages of medicine in the United States. Men that left their homes were exposed for the first time to new diseases that they had no immunities against. The lack of food, shelter, and proper clothing would also contribute to the common cold that would soon turn into pneumonia. About 2/3 of the 620,000 soldiers' deaths were the result of disease or infection. That means that more soldiers died in the Civil War from disease than they did in the actual battles. A good thing that came out of all the improper medical practices done during the Civil War was there was actually many medical advances that resulted from this war, things like the use of quarantine, which virtually eliminated yellow fever, arterial ligation, which means a surgical procedure that involves tying off an artery, usually before amputation. Also, there was no coordinated system to get the injured off of the battlefield and into the dressing stations, so another medical advance was the development of an ambulance system for evacuation of the wounded, as well as using trains and boats to transport patients. Do you think if hygiene was a known factor, that there could have been less casualties to disease and infection? What would happen to survivors of the war after they went home with a stump of an arm or a leg? The Civil War overall left such a huge impact in history and will always be remembered as one of the most tragic and brutal wars of all time.